I want to now bring in political analyst Professor Andre Duvenhage, who has probably been listening to parts of what he was saying. Prof, a very good afternoon to you, and thank you so much for joining us. Now, of course, Herman Mashaba talking a lot about action, in this particular address, saying an era of action is needed in South Africa to move the country forward. This, of course, he says, this, of course, is the first time ActionSA is participating in this crucial election, as you know. So what do you then make, of this particular party and its trajectory, particularly seeing that in 2021 it contested in just 3 municipalities in Gauteng and 3 in KwaZulu-Natal, and this year it will be contesting in all 9 provinces come the 29th of May?
Good afternoon. Yes, I think it is quite a different scenario for Action South Africa at the moment. In 2021, as you mentioned, they basically only compete in Gauteng and KZN, but now it is on a national level. Now, I believe they had relative success in Gauteng and also to a certain extent in KwaZulu-Natal, and they believe with that formula they can achieve success on national and provincial level. But we need to take into consideration this is a very big election, it's a controversial election already, but I think the Action South Africa grouping is one of the parties that can establish itself within a new environment. And if you look at their policies, they are focusing on things that are important, for example, job creation, education, specifically access to education, the power shortage and how they want to deal with the Eskom thing, the restoration of the rule of law and specifically control. So if you want to position Action South Africa within the political spectrum, it is more or less to the center, somewhere between, I think, the moderate ANC and the Democratic Alliance. And I believe among the middle class in South Africa, there is the potential for mobilizing support, but within a very competitive environment.
It is a very competitive environment. In fact, just leading up to this manifesto, one of the things that ActionSA has been stressing is that it may be a small party, or at least a new party, but it's definitely not a small party. We know, of course, that it has chairpersons in all 9 provinces, which, of course, these are their premier candidates as well. So it has really entrenched itself. It's also in discussions with key political parties, other political parties, in as far as, just alliances, going into this election and post this election, of course, given the fact that we know that the ANC will not necessarily be enjoying the numbers that it has seen in the past, and also given the new entrants that we have seen also in the running. So it has secured itself, you would imagine, and positioned itself strategically at this point. How well will this maneuvering, this negotiation, stead the party going into this election?
Well, they are already part of the multi-party charter and working together with a number of other parties. In the environment we are entering, my take on it is that coalition politics are becoming very, very important, and that leaves room for smaller parties to become actively involved in politics and in some cases playing a very decisive role in the formation of governments. And I believe they have a stronghold in both Gauteng and KZN. And these are the 2 provinces that I believe we may see the biggest changes in the coming 2024 elections. So they have a role to play there. But before they can play that role, they first need to organize and mobilize support. And in that context, they must compete with parties like the Democratic Alliance that has currently a lot of momentum. Some of the surveys are indicating a support base above 25%. We are looking at a declining ANC, but we know that the ANC will gain a lot of momentum closer to the election. That is their political pattern before elections. But then there's also the EFF, and if the MK party is going to compete, they will also be involved. And then a number of other parties like the Patriotic Alliance and so on. So it's not going to be easy to gain enough and sufficient support. It's going to be competitive, and I believe if they can ensure 2 to 3% support, and maybe a bit more, especially in Gauteng province, they can play a role in specifically coalition politics.
And you mentioned, of course, the crucial competitiveness, that we are currently seeing between these various parties. I want to talk a little bit about KZN. You mentioned, of course, the MK party. With the MK party now firmly, establishing itself, particularly in KZN, what are the prospects for, parties like, for instance, the EFF, like ActionSA, and, of course, the ANC?
Well, in the latest Brandhurst survey, we have seen that, according to that specific survey, that the biggest single party measured in KZN is already the MK party, with something like 38% of the support. And if we look at the second one, it's way down, and that is the ANC. And then we have the IFP and the DA. Which also has strong support bases in KZN. And then you must take into consideration there will always be a minority that will vote for the Freedom Front Plus and some of the other smaller parties. So it's not going to be that easy, especially in an environment that may become a lot more conflict-orientated. We have seen the current conflict between the IFP and the ANC. We are looking at high levels of identity politics. And in the case of KZN, we are talking about the Zulu identity. And it will be an open question if ActionSA can establish their authority within that environment. And I think that is going to be their biggest challenge. When it comes to Gauteng, it will probably be a bit easier because it's more of an urban environment, it's more cosmopolitan, more middle-class orientated, which I believe is closer to the ideology and policies of Action South Africa.
The conflict that you mentioned between the IFP as well as the ANC, I mean, how detrimental is that, given the fact that, as you say, KZN being this battleground, particularly for these various parties, the IFP accusing the ANC of being propagandists, etc. I mean, how well does this conflict create an opportunity for other parties, as you've mentioned, but also detriment to both these parties, the IFP and the ANC?
I believe in an environment of high levels of conflict escalating into violence, people will be forced, or voters will be forced, to choose sides. At the moment, we are looking at 3, maybe 4 strong factors there. On the one line, it's the old historical battle between the ANC and the IFP, where about 20,000 people were killed, maybe even more, during the 80s. So there's a history of conflict there and violence. Then when you look at the MK party, it's absolutely clear that they will resort to unconventional attempts in order to gain momentum, to ensure support. And we have also seen conflict between the MK party and the ANC. The Democratic Alliance is probably a bit on the other side, more catering for the minority groups, therefore out of the Zulu context in a sense, although we must say that they are part of the alliance, including the IFP. And the IFP itself may be a very interesting party to watch, because I believe they may play their cards according to their situation. Now, your question is, where will Action South Africa be? I believe they can make some inroads in probably the urban areas. But when it comes to the more traditional Zulu areas, especially to the north, it will be difficult for them to gain momentum and a lot of support and become a significant factor in KZN.
Prof, as we wrap up, and very briefly, if you may, I want to ask you now about the Congress of the People. I mean, they've postponed their launch, which was the launch of their manifesto, which was meant to take place today. Just yesterday, the party saying that it was ready to, to launch its manifesto. What do you make of this, particularly in this highly competitive environment?
Well, if we look at the COPE party, we have seen a decline in support, also a severe decline in support over the last number of elections, coming to the point where COPE as a party is not a political factor anymore. And I am not seeing them getting a lot of support in the 2024 elections. Maybe they can end up with a candidate or two in the National Assembly and maybe 1 here, 1 there in the provincial environment. But I think the more likely scenario is that this may be the last election where COPE will compete on a national basis and in the majority of provinces in South Africa.